All right, and we are live.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We are at the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee again. I think we're roughly halfway through this year's meetings here. We already heard from previous speakers a lot of very interesting and a very resourceful information there. So today we have a few teams with us. We'll start with fee discussion. We have a team from DPW and Office of Sustainability to discuss the watershed fee issues that county is facing. And that will be followed by Mark DeLuca from DPW to talk about solid waste funding issue the county is going through currently. Those two fees are designated for specific services there and directly impact either capital or operating services there for those. So I think it's an important discussion so folks understand where we are currently. And following that, we have two exciting PowerPoint presentations by economists in our own committee. The first is by Dr. Irani, and there was an interesting macroeconomic outlook discussion. There's also some coverage on regional economic outlook there. And following that is Dr. Clinch. We're all very familiar with him. He's going to talk about specifically for Howard County and Maryland, and also include some personal income projections, which is really critical to our own revenue forecasting. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first group of speakers there. I think Lindsay is planning to share her screen. Go ahead. Thank you. You and Mark. Well, I forgot to mention that I also have my colleague, Brooke Mamo, Deputy Director from Budget Office, join us. He is an expert on those two fees as well, so he might chime in together with the two when we discuss these watershed and solid waste. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. My name is Mark Richmond. I'm the Chief of the Stormwater Management Division within DPW. And when Lindsay gets started, she will introduce herself. But we're here to talk about the Watershed Protection and Restoration Fund and the need for a fee increase. I'm going to start out talking about what in both the capital and operating budgets the Watershed Fund is used for. And then Lindsay's going to talk a little bit of nuts and bolts on the actual fee itself. So to start out with, there are two major points of emphasis in the capital budget for use of the Watershed Fund. The first is repairing existing stormwater management ponds. The county does a triennial inspection on a rolling basis of all of the ponds within the county, and it rates the infrastructure, which is the vertical and horizontal components, typically pipes that allow the water to exit the pond. So we look at that infrastructure and we rate it on a scale of 1 to 4, with 4 being the most critical in need of replacement or repair. As you can see, and we've broken this out by both the rating and the council districts, as well as a total, that shows that we have a significant number of ponds that have a rating of 4, where we need to do either repair or replacement of that infrastructure. Typically, it's metal now. It has reached its service life, and we are replacing it with concrete, which will have a much longer service life. At this time, a typical pond repair or replacement project will cost about $1.7 million on average. If we were to look at all of the 4 rated ponds and the $1.7 million, that's $126 million, which admittedly is way too much money to look at for an individual year. So we looked at a more realistic and reasonable number, which is addressing 7 to 8 ponds each year, which gives a requirement of $13 million. Granted, it'll take us about a decade to get through all of them, but we feel that the $13 million is a reasonable ask in a given year. The next slide shows some of the problems that we are seeing with some of the infrastructure, so it's not just numbers on a slide. The upper photo shows a separation between the vertical and the horizontal pipe, and that allows water and the sediment it takes with it to get out through the barrel pipe. And if this is left unfixed, it could cause the entire dam, the entire embankment to breach. The bottom left picture shows, well, actually it doesn't show the bottom of the pipe because the bottom of the pipe has corroded and rusted out. That's also something that happens with metal over a 20, 30, 40-year lifespan. The bottom right photograph shows a collapse of the horizontal barrel pipe, and it is no longer going into the concrete box. You can see the gap. And this was brought to our attention a number of years ago. This has been fixed, but it was brought to our attention by a neighbor calling us and saying, the lake behind my property, it's no longer there. So we had about 8 feet of water that was permanently in this pond released because of this failure. So I just wanted to point out some of the actual photos from Howard County where we have seen a definite need for repair. Moving on to the next slide. We also use capital budget to help meet our NPDES permit, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. That's through the Maryland Department of the Environment. And the capital budget is used primarily for addressing requirements to treat impervious acres and to meet TMDL, total maximum daily load, credits and criteria. And based on our current permit, we're estimating about $3.5 million per year is needed to help us meet those NPDES requirements. If we combine the two needs for the ponds and for the NPDES permit, we're looking at about $16.5 million each year, and that's in 2023 dollars. If we do not if we don't increase the fee and build up the fund, the needs that I just talked about would have to go into the GO bonds or PAYGO or some other source of funding. If we just didn't do or couldn't do the work that I just mentioned, the pond repair or lack of repair could lead to emergency road closures, public and private property damage, possible personal injury, definite environmental degradation. If we don't meet our NPDES permit requirements, we could be facing a consent order. And that essentially means that we still have to do the work, but we then have monetary penalties added over and above having to do the work. There's also a need for watershed fund in the operating budget. Currently, there are 16 full-time employees in 4 different groups within the county. The watershed fund also helps pay for debt service for stormwater bonds. And there was a project that was done a number of years ago at the Patrick Farm to improve water quality. And that got a state water quality loan. So we're still paying the debt service on that. As far as annual support, there's close to $3.5 million estimated for a variety of things. One is additional support for the NPDES program. And this is not capital projects, but it's keeping our database up to date, doing annual reporting, doing annual monitoring of the streams and ponds within the county. It covers work to Howard Eco Works for doing environmental work on small private properties. It also includes grants, both to nonprofits and private property owners to help get additional water quality projects built. And it includes money for tree planting and forest enhancement. And again, if if we don't have money in the fund, this would have to shift to general funds. At this point, what the money that we do have in the Watershed Protection Fund is only available for paying debt service. There's no money left for doing the capital projects. So without the fee, we just definitely need the fee to help with our FY25 efforts, both capital and operating. And I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay DeMarzo to talk a little bit about how our fees compare to other jurisdictions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark said, my name is Lindsay DeMarzo. I am with the Howard County Office of Community Sustainability, and I work on pilot projects, private property initiatives such as reimbursement and credit programs for stormwater, and then also policy. So as a review of what our current stormwater fee looks like, we have several residential categories, and then we have a non-residential category. So the first, apartments, condominiums, townhouses, and mobile home park properties are billed at $15 per unit annually. These are all annual fees that we're looking at. Single family development on an acre, on less than a quarter of an acre lot is billed at $45. Single family dwelling on greater than a quarter acre lot is billed at $90. Agricultural properties have the ability to acquire a water quality plan or a forest conservation plan through our Department of Natural Resources. With either of those plans, they are eligible to receive a flat rate of $90 per year. If an agricultural property does not obtain one of those plans or hold one of those plans, then they do pay the non-residential rate. As you can see, the non-residential rate is billed at $15 for every 500 square feet of impervious surface on the property. We do have a commercial cap currently in place, which says our stormwater fee cannot exceed 5% of a commercial property's total property taxes. Now, we looked at how we compare to some of our neighboring jurisdictions, and most neighboring jurisdictions have very different fee structures than us. There are a variety of different options to slice this. So looking at how our typical lot sizes fall into each of their fee rates, we're able to compare apples to apples here, which is what this chart shows. This is for our small to medium residential fees. I apologize, the scale is so large, so it's hard to zoom in directly onto some of these, but as you can see, Howard County fees are shown in orange, and the neighboring jurisdictions are shown in blue. This shows that Howard County's fees currently, annually, are very low compared to our neighbors, if not the lowest. Likewise, for commercial properties, we're seeing something very similar. You can see Howard County again in orange, very low compared to our neighboring jurisdictions, if not the lowest. Now, in the last year, 5 of our neighboring jurisdictions increased their fee. So it's not uncommon and not unusual to do this. In fact, it's probably unusual that we have not increased our fee in the last 10 years. And as Mark pointed out, things are in need of that. So that is the end of my slides. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Mark and Lindsay. So it's open to the committee. Anybody, if you have questions, just feel free to unmute yourself and raise a question. Thank you both.
Hey, Holly. This is
Brooke, go ahead.
It's not a question, but I just want to reiterate something that Lindsay said. Our fee was initially implemented in FY14, so 10 years ago. During that time, we have not increased our fees. And our fees typically grow about half a percentage point a year, but our expenses grow at a rate of 3 to 5%. So there's that imbalance in the growth rate between our expenses and our revenues. So now we're at this point where we're projecting at the start of FY25, even if we don't do the capital projects that Mark Richmond talked about that are critical with the pond maintenance, just from existing debt we've issued and operating expenses that we currently have, we don't have adequate revenues to cover our expenses. So the option we have is we either have to adjust our fees or eliminate certain of the services that we provide. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Thank you, Brooke. And you're talking about both operating and CIP, right? Because this fund still has to pay historical debt service and also the operating service. Yeah. And on the capital side, I know that historically for the last decade also, it's primarily rely on this designated fee to support the capital needs on that there. So at this point is basically all this resource has been exhausted, and the future years revenue has to be used to support existing debt plus the operating needs, which is both have been increasing. So if we don't do anything, then there's pretty dire consequence on capital directly and also on operating side there, because the cost has to be on the capital side have to switch to geo bonds, which used to be paid by this fund, and on the operating side it will either need to cut service dramatically or shift the cost to general fund, basically. All right, thank you, Brooke.
Holly, Todd here.
Go ahead.
Is this department supposed to be self-funded, or is it already funded by a combination of these specific fees, which are dedicated to it, and general obligation funding?
Yeah, this is supposed to be self-sustainable, but the fund is supporting. So the services there listed early are supposed to be fully recovered by this fee, and the cost is actually higher than the revenues collected. And also the capital budget is also supposed to be supported by this fee when these fees are sufficient to cover that. If not, then it will spill over to other funds, which is general fund and geo to cover it, which is added on top of existing geo bonds burden.
So when you say that it's supposed to be self-funding, what does that mean? Is there a statutory?
The fee is designated to this purpose for both capital and operating for this needs. And
No, that part I understand. I just mean, right now we're absorbing some of these costs outside of the fee collections. That's
no
with general fund money, right?
Currently it is pretty much self-sustainable, but until now. But because the fee is not catching up with the cost on both operating CIP, the gap will become bigger. So going forward, it can no longer support that with the current fee structure.
Right, but I'm getting to the use of the word "supposed to be self-funding." What does that mean? Is there a statutory requirement to do so, or that's just the objective?
Brooke, do you want to say something? Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that question, Todd. So it's not a statutory requirement, but the intent when the fee was implemented was that the capital expenses and the operating expenses necessary, like that were listed by Mark and Lindsay, were supposed to be covered by the fee. That was the intent. The problem is the fee has never been adjusted and is growing at a much slower pace than our expenses. So we're at the point, starting next year, that the fee that we generate, unless we do something, is going to be inadequate to cover these expenses. It's not a statutory requirement. It's not an enterprise fund. But then what happens at that point? At that point, we either scale back some of the services we provide, and I don't think for most of them, probably all of them, we don't have that option. Then we have to look at the general fund to pick up that gap, whether it be on the capital side with geo bonds or on the operating side. And we've had many discussions and probably a few awaiting us about the challenges on geo bond funding and all the other capital projects that we're dealing with.
So is Ellicott City Safe and Sound compromising our ability to support the maintenance of our existing stormwater management?
No, because currently we don't have any of these fees going to Ellicott City Safe and Sound capital projects. We're funding it with a combination of grants, some other loans, and geo bonds and PAYGO funding. So this fee is primarily on the capital side, supporting stormwater pond maintenance that Mark Richmond spoke about, and also MDE required permits that we estimated cost us about $3.5 million a year. So not a direct relationship with the Ellicott City Safe and Sound. Now, if we have no choice and have to look at the general fund to help pay for these expenses traditionally paid out of this fee, then yeah, something has to give, right? Because we have all these other challenges like Ellicott City Safe and Sound, school system, and other projects, so it has to compete with that, and it's just not enough funding to cover all these needs.
Thanks.
Holly, can I?
Thank you.
It's Ellen.
Yeah,
Can
sure.
I?
Go ahead, Ellen.
Okay, so I guess my question is, you're talking about an increase in fees. Is the increase you're talking about sufficient to cover the 16.5 and the 3.5 that you're expecting to spend next year, or does this still, is it still going to have an impact on the GO bonds and the and operating funding? Because just talking about increasing a fee, if you don't know how much revenue you expect to yield from that, is hard to tell. In the same way that it's hard to tell how comparable we are to neighboring counties, when all we know is we might be the lowest, but by what percentage, in what way have others done it? That's all to help understand. I don't mean that someone's deliberately obfuscating or whatever, but are you anticipating raising the fees enough to cover the money that you're citing here is the minimum that has to be done in the coming year? That's important. You nodded. That was good.
Understood. So, Holly, if I may try to address this. So, at this point in time, we don't have a specific fee proposal. We're in the process of trying to calculate internally, if we do a fee increase, what kind of an increase do we need? Is it something we do just once? Is it something we phase in? Is it something we adjust going forward with an inflationary adjustment? So we're doing that calculation internally, discussing with some stakeholders to come up with a recommendation. So it's a little bit early at this point for us to discuss this as our specific proposal. But what we wanted to show the committee is the need, right? The need we have both on the operating and capital side, I think, is clear. And our current fee structure is inadequate to cover it going forward. So something has to give. Likely scenario is a fee adjustment. Otherwise, the only option is to shift the cost to the general fund, which is already strained, and which means other things will suffer.
Well, that's our main concern, because we're not looking at projects. We're just looking at what the constraints on the budget are likely to be and what level of borrowing do we think you need to go to and whatever. So it's important to understand that there are, as I'm reading this, additional pressures on that budget that are going to have to be managed some way or another. And we need to be aware that they're on the level of what looks to me like pretty much close to $20 million worth of annual fees that some way or another are going to have to be accommodated, that we have not had to address in the same way in past years.
Yeah, Alan, you're absolutely right. I think these are the very important points when we are pondering on those how to address those challenges. There, basically, as you mentioned and Brooke already alluded, there are a couple of things we are looking at. We look at how to make it sustainable if we want to continue to use this fee primarily be self-supporting for those needed services there, and what level of adjustment will be needed to make that work. We also want to make sure it's still comparable with the key competitors, other jurisdictions. You don't want us to be the one who costs people more than other counties. So we want to remain reasonable and competitive for our taxpayers on that. But finally, it's also important to understand how does that connect to other things. To see in the big picture, I think both you and Todd and others understand that if this issue doesn't get addressed adequately, basically those additional costs on both capital and operating will indirectly, but as a consequence, impact the capacity for other capital project and operating needs on that, because eventually everything get connected on that. So all those different things are important. We just have to assess everything and make the, you know, the balance.
Well, no, it's that everything exists in context. Nothing exists in the abstract. And so it's the combination of all these things and all of those different factors that need to be considered. But the main thing I think we take into this is something we have not had to deal with necessarily in the past, because the adjustments, or at least the determination of what a reasonable amount of funding was that could be funded from the fund, was what was being done. But now you're looking at essentially only being able to cover the debt service this coming year. So everything else comes out on the table, and that's a critical factor to determine in how we go forward and how that impacts other things. So that's all I wanted to make sure we were looking at. And also how it really does compare to other places, because our competitiveness with other jurisdictions impacts not just our growth, but our sustainability. So
exactly.
yes, there you go. I'm off now.
Is the expectation that any proposed fee increase be sufficient to cover increased debt service levels and increased operating costs? Or would the fee increases, or could the fee increases be dedicated specifically to covering debt service? Or will it necessarily be just fees that go in to support the general obligation bond issuances, and this is just one other element within the GO issuance?
So still in the process of discussing that, but ideally, at least from my perspective, the initial intent of the fee would still hold, that the capital expenses that we identified and the operating expenses would continue to be covered with this fee. So when I said that this fee is not going to be able to cover our existing obligation and ongoing operating expenses in FY25, I did not mean 100% of them, right? So we still have about $10 million in fees that we generate annually under the current structure. So, you know, that goes to cover a portion of the debt service for debts that have been issued and ongoing operating expenses. But we're not going to have 100% of the revenue we need to cover these costs. And that gap or that deficit is going to grow every single year unless we do something. So I think the intent, because of all the challenges we have in the general fund, both on the capital side and operating side, and the original intent of this fee when it was implemented, we would continue to cover these expenses with this fee, and any increase ideally would address that.
So I have a question.
Barbara?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So with the number 3 stormwater ponds, how many of those do we see turning into 4s rather quickly? And I didn't quite get a sense of what we're talking about in terms of the total annual need right now. And then do you have any sort of projections at all about what the fee structure might look like? I mean, where would that land? I mean, are there any initial thoughts about that?
This is Mark Richmond. I'll handle the first 2 questions, and I'll defer to Brooke on number 3. The threes, I don't have an exact number or an exact time frame for when the 3s will turn into 4s, but they certainly will. They will turn into, the rating from 3 to 4 will probably be, well, we still have 4s to deal with. So, 5 years, 10 years, it's heading that way, but they're not as bad right now. Second question, the annual requirement. I was looking at an annual need for the pond repairs of 13 million. That will obviously go up due to inflation every year, but right now in current dollars, I'm looking at 13 million to do 7 to 8 ponds a year.
But on top of that, you had the operating costs, the new staff. So like, how much are you looking at annually for the total, I mean, the total amount? I'm not getting a sense.
Yes, Barbara. So this is Brooke. Total needs, if we're talking about FY25 as an example, would be roughly about 27 million, 26 to 27 million.
Okay.
And currently the fee generates about 10 million.
Okay. And are there any kind of initial thoughts about how this fee is going to be distributed?
Yeah. So at this point, and Holly can weigh in, but I think it would be a little premature to share because we're still in the process of trying to come up, the best scenario, looking at other jurisdictions, the impact on fee payers. Do we do this in 1 year? Do we phase it in? So we're having the internal discussions about what would be the best proposal, to meet our needs, but also lessen the impact on fee payers and still keep our advantage as far as how we compare to other jurisdictions.
And what's your time frame?
Ideally, I would say maybe in a matter of a couple of weeks, we may have a proposal finalized or close to it.
Information maybe for our report?
Yes. So but if we have it in time at a point to be made public and to share, definitely.
Great, thank you.
But so I'm clear. We need to roughly triple the fee to balance, to go from 10 to 27. That's if we're spending. That's if we're paying cash for the capital improvements. If we're not paying cash for the capital improvements, then it goes down considerably, but now we have debt on our balance sheet.
Yes. Yep. So that's another thing we're in the process of evaluating because, like you mentioned, we have a couple ways to address the capital needs. You can do cash or pay-go funding with the fees. Obviously, that has less long-term expense because you don't have the interest payment and for 20 years, and then you also have issuing debt where the obligations are over a 20-year period. So what is the right balance of a mix between issuing debt as we've done in the past and also using pay-go? So historically we've done a combination of the two to meet our capital objectives. And that would be the ideal mix that we look at going forward also.
We're issuing above our 10% threshold, so that's a concern if we're looking at increasing that debt service. So just, again, as we just look at all of these things, but whatever you come up with, wherever you are in this thinking, at the very least, this needs to be reflected in our report to show this is a concern that will impact the decisions that the county makes about debt level and about the allocation of funding. So I really appreciate getting the heads up.
Yeah, and that's definitely why I wanted to share this with you. Even though the analysis and the recommendation is not final, we wanted the committee to have a sense of the challenges we're facing and potential implications on GO bonds and our overall general fund expenses.
Are revenue bonds an option, or is it purely GOs?
I mean, this would be a revenue bond, right? It's a stormwater-backed revenue bonds. If the debt issued stays within this fund and is paid by the fees that we generate.
So then, to be clear, revenue bond financing is a possibility in this case because there's a dedicated revenue source that can be used to pay the revenue bonds.
It currently is paid by the existing watershed bonds are paid through this revenue, not using general fund to pay. But if in the future, if the fee is not available to support existing or future debt, then it will shift it to general fund to pay those debt there. That's
Right.
the connection there. Yeah. Currently, it's not. Currently, it's the current. This watershed fund is paying those debt, existing debt.
But the payroll associated with day-to-day operations is
They're
paid
also
for out of
from
general
this fund.
funds.
No, they're
I'm sorry?
also from this. Well, people doing those services also charged to this fund.
Todd, the initial presentation, when Mark and Lindsay spoke about the capital needs and also the operating needs, historically since FY14, they've been paid out of this fee. The whole challenge is, we're not going to be able to continue to pay all those expenses with this fee unless we do something on the fee side. If we don't do something with the fees, then part of these expenses would have to shift to the general fund.
And the entity at risk, if we get fined because we're not in compliance with the NDPS or the storm or the discharge permit, is the county itself, or it's this authority?
Well, and Mark can speak that, but I think our obligation doesn't go away if we don't meet the requirements. We still have that obligation, but we also would be subject to penalties. But hopefully Mark Richmond is still on the line and he can chime in.
But who's? I guess my point is, who's the we? The county
County. It's
or
county.
this
The
authority?
county.
The county.
The county.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay. Yep.
It's not the fund. It's the county. It's an obligation on the county, and we just use this fund and fee as a mechanism to meet our requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's really, really important discussion to address relevant services and especially infrastructures, as a lot of those pond pipes are aging and need repairs there. Anyway, I think we need to move on to the next subject. Mark DeLuca, do you want to share slides from your side? Thank you.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And while I'm loading this up, I'll just say that a lot of the questions that you've asked already, I believe that will be similar to this one. And I think you can see my screen. Let's see.
Make a little bigger. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So there we go. So this is about the solid waste fund, which is a special fund. It's not a, it doesn't operate as a enterprise fund. It's a special fund, very similar to the stormwater fund. So we'll just get right into this. So just as a fun summary to bring you up to speed on where this has been, we've had increases in waste disposal costs. In FY23, the county experienced significant price hikes for the cost of waste export from $43 a ton to $64 a ton. And as a result, we had a $3 million operating deficit in FY24, which we went to council for a budget amendment to supplement our fund from our balance fund, supplement our operating costs with approximately $3 million. Some of that was as a result of this price increase. A large part of it was, but also a large part was the increase in total waste tonnage. The county experienced increases in waste tonnages over the last 4 years. In FY20, as our baseline year, we had 118,000 tons of trash that was processed at a cost of about $5.3 million. Subsequently, the 3-year average after that has been approximately 132,000 tons at a cost of 8.1. So our cost just in export and transportation costs to get rid of our trash has gone up $3 million. Now, that that resulted in us exceeding our capacity at our county transfer station at Alpha Ridge Landfill. It increased our handling and pre-processing costs, just us handling the trash to get it onto tractor trailers, to get it off to our export facility. It increased the number of trips we had to the export facility, and it threatened our ability in future years to pay our debt service necessary to fund capital improvements to repair and replace or meet the increased demand that we were experiencing at the landfill. So left unaddressed, this will result in potential reduction of curbside services in the near future years as we're trying to address how we would make up shortfalls in operating costs, potential reduction in operating hours at Alpha Ridge Landfill in the near future years. Not saying it's going to happen this year, not saying it's going to happen next year, but it's a near-term problem we'll need to deal with, and a reduction in services that will result in a reduction of services to resident and commercial customers. Now, this is a chart that I think explains a lot of where we have seen waste tonnages by sector. And if I can get my pointer to work this time, this gray line, these gray bars are the curbside waste. So these are handled by the trash trucks that drive through the neighborhoods, pick all the waste up at the curbside, and they take it directly to our waste facility. And we're averaging about 70,000 tons at the curb over the last 3 years, from 21 to 23. This has been an increase. Now, specifically at the landfill, these orange or rust-colored bars represent government and residential waste at the landfill. And what we mean by residential waste at the landfill is when people come during the week or on a Saturday and drop off trash in the residence area, along with recycling and things like that. But specifically, we're counting the trash here. They drop off their trash, and so we're counting that separately. And then also government waste is not what we're collecting at the facility, like if it's a government building or the library or the schools or wherever, but what our Bureau of Highways or utilities or facilities bureaus bring to us as a result of repairs that they're making on the street. They bring it into us, and possibly Rex and Parks as well. So you can see from this chart that the rust color, government and residential, has been pretty much level. We did have a bump in 2021, and we expected everything to be a little bit higher. We attributed it, at least originally, we were attributing all our gains in tonnages to the pandemic and just people throwing away more. But what you'll notice is that residential is, at the curb is pretty much level, and also at the, but it has gone up, but it appears to be leveling. Government residential appears to level, but our commercial sector has grown tremendously. And so if we look back 10 years to 2013 and we look at our commercial, we were probably at 20,000 tons. We were processing that, which was a very good amount for us. And then when we look at it in FY23, we're close to 50,000 tons. So we've seen a dramatic increase here. So what we did was in our FY24 residential fee calculation, I just want to draw your attention to the text box first. And our analysis here was to look at the number of households that we service, the total tons of material we collect, collection and export costs, broke that down by household, administrative costs per household, landfill maintenance and compliant costs per household. And I mentioned as a cost share because taking it to the landfill, we're cost sharing along with commercial. So it was really based on how much commercial, how much was residential. Our actual, I'll go to the chart, the table, our actual FY24 curbside collection costs equaled $391.30, roughly $391. Our current fee, and this was with the, and I failed to mention that in FY24, we in FY23, we requested an increase in our fee for the FY24 year, knowing that our operating costs were in a deficit, and we planned to raise the fee. We did raise the fee, and it is in two parts. The first part was in 24, and we collected, it resulted in an increase in the fee, residential fee, at $365. So our actual costs are $391. Our fee reimbursed us $365. So we were at a deficit of $26 in the residential. In the commercial, we saw something very similar. We based this on the current number of permit holders, the tons of material that was brought in and processed, and of course, transportation export costs, but we normalized that to a per ton cost. Same thing with administrative and landfill infrastructure costs, that was per ton. And so what we calculated was an actual FY24 commercial tip fee cost of $106 per ton. That was our actual cost. The current tip fee to commercial vendors was $80 a ton. So we had a difference of $26 a ton. So we wanted to take a look at, where we were in comparison to other jurisdictions surrounding us. We took a look at Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County, and Montgomery County, and we wanted to see how they were compensating themselves for their waste. So the first row here is, do they set costs out for trash collection on their tax bill? Baltimore County does not. They don't have a special fund. They aren't an enterprise fund. Everything is handled through their general fund. Anne Arundel County does. They have, they do set it out on their tax bill. And in Anne Arundel, they have a $380 residential fee and a $380 commercial fee. In Howard County, we do set it out separately. And we have a $350 trash fee for just trash and recycling without wood waste collection. And we have a $365 fee that includes wood waste, trash collection, food scraps. And we also charge $30 for an annual commercial permit. In Montgomery County, they have a $453 residential recycling, trash, and wood waste fee. And their commercial is based on a sliding benefit charge based on tonnage from that particular trash hauler, in addition to their tax fee. So in other words, what a sliding benefit charge might be, that if they fall if they're 500 tons or less, they get charged this system benefit charge. If it's 1,500 tons per year to 501, they get charged a second system benefit charge, and it's tiered, where it goes up in each tier. In Prince George's County, which is not listed here, they have a very similar system benefit charge, but it's based on land use. So if you are a fast food restaurant and your land use code is whatever that happens to be, and they're in their planning department, then you would get charged this specific system benefit charge. And it's also based on square footage. So there are, our neighboring jurisdictions have a lot of different ways to bring the income in. Now we'll go to the third row, and this is the tip fee. So Baltimore County has everything in the general fund, but they charge commercial $100 tip fee per ton of waste that they bring in. Anne Arundel County is charging $85 a ton, and Howard County currently charges $80 a ton. Anne Arundel charges $85 a ton. Montgomery County charges $70 a ton. And so to try and make heads or tails out of everything that's presented here is difficult because it just doesn't look like an apples to oranges presentation of fees. But I'll add that this last row, actively landfilling. So in Baltimore County, they actively landfill. In Anne Arundel, they actively landfill. In Howard, we do not. In Montgomery County, they do not. And they do take their waste to the incinerator that they have at Dickerson, but they are phasing that out. So they will be in a total export position, very similar to us. We totally export all of our trash, and we've been doing that for 30 years. So approximately 30 years. Now, why is that significant? Because it's a lot cheaper to landfill if you have a facility than it is to pay for the export price. And so each of these counties, Baltimore and Anne Arundel, they can control what they have to spend on export to some extent because they can budget very specifically. We're only going to allow 100,000 tons or 150,000 tons to be exported, and we'll budget this much money to do that. And then when we collect total 200,000 tons of waste, that extra amount we will landfill. And as long as they can maintain capacity in their landfills, they can offset their prices. And so they can play with those prices and keep things, for example, in Baltimore County, they can keep their costs in the general fund and charge a $100 tip fee, whereas Anne Arundel will charge $380 to every resident and $380 to commercial, and this have a much bigger base to collect money from, and then keep the tip rate at 85 per ton. So we recognize that we're in the process now of discussing this with stakeholders and with others to, much like Brooke was saying before about the stormwater fee, to see what would be, what do we think would be a more transparent way to do this? What do we think would be a most equitable way to do this increases? But the bottom line for showing you this information is that without increases at all, then we wouldn't be able to pay our debt service for the 20-year period. And right now, we are very challenged to afford any new improvements at the landfill because our fees are not high enough to carry our debt service. And every year there's an increasing amount of legislation that comes out of Annapolis that requires us to do necessary things, but different things that cost different amounts of money. So we definitely have that burden on us. For example, last year was the greenhouse gas reduction. And so we're going to need to remediate for greenhouse gas, which might be where we might have emissions from greenhouse gas. And but we need to finance that and the repairs that may generate. This year, it looks like we will be testing for PFAS, which is one of the forever chemicals, and we'll be needing to test for that. And we haven't been told yet, but if we hit certain levels, I'm sure we were going to have to remediate for that. So it's additional burdens that in previous years we just didn't have that. So that's really the end of my presentation. And if Brooke or Holly have anything else that they would like to add.
Thank you, Mark. I'll open to questions. Thanks.
Hi, Mark. I'm Todd Arterburn here. Just a quick question. Are all of the costs associated with handling the trash prior to export or preparing for export done by county employees?
No. So at the landfill, we utilize contractors. Well, let's start with curbside collections. We utilize contractors to do our curbside collecting, and then that trash is taken directly to an export facility at Annapolis Junction and then transported by rail to Virginia in King George, Virginia. So they're all contractors that do that. And then in addition to that, we use contractors. The staff at the landfill is all county employees. However, we do have one contractor at the landfill that helps us with solid waste. And that is once the material is brought to our transfer station where it's dumped there, then we pick it up, we handle it, smash it up, do whatever. I call it pre-processing. Then we take that and we put it into these like 55 foot long trailers, which is a transfer company that we bid out to, and they haul it in those large trailers. They haul it to the export facility in Annapolis Junction. So that's the way that we use contractors.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
A
Very
lot of
good.
information to digest. So for sake of the time, if no more questions, let's move on to economic discussion. Dr. Irani, would you like us to share the screen, or you would like to run the slides from your side?
Actually, could you share the screen, please?
Oh, sure. Hold on. Can you see it?
Yes, thank you.
All right, go ahead.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. So the theme, and I'm gonna look at the national and a little bit of the state economy, but AI has really become sort of a newest and perhaps even significant transformative technology that will likely change our economy. I should state that the time of Skynet is far off, and it's still, this technology is still in its juvenile phase, but it is here. It is here to stay. But it's going to have a significant impact on our future economy. And obviously those counties or regions that are investing in research and analysis of this might stand to be might do well going forward. So but let me just talk about nationally about some of the challenges, right? So the war in Ukraine is approaching 2 years this February. The conflict in Gaza looks like it's spreading out a little bit. We're seeing more and more attacks in the shipping lanes, which are affecting shipping times as well as shipping costs. Workforce shortages continue to kind of plague us, driven by labor force participation rates. Continuing inflation, not as significant as it was at 9%. Rising interest rates, which have tamed inflation, but at a cost. Climate change impacts. I mean, we were fortunate this past month that nothing sort of bad happened in Ellicott City with the heavy rains, but we did see in Baltimore County on the eastern side, there were some flooding that went on. We saw political challenges, right? We have a divided Congress. We have an upcoming bruising and divisive presidential campaign, which could impact decisions around providing continued aid to Ukraine as well as Israel. And obviously, we saw this latest thing about should we take action on the border when we want action, but we don't want to take action because it might be politically beneficial to someone else. Obviously, any one of these things could have an impact in the economy, and some have impacted the economy. But, generally speaking, we have been resilient. Next slide, please. So this has not been updated. Most recent data shows 3.1% annual GDP growth, which, significantly above its long-term average of about 2 and 3%, which has been good. For many households, though, this number seems somewhat abstract. But, and I'll hold off on talking a little bit about that as well. But the idea being is that even though the economy has seen record GDP growth as well as record low unemployment, for many households, what they measure success by is how much they pay for gas at the gas pump, as well as how much they pay for groceries every week, as well as basically what they pay on their credit cards. Next slide, please. Just to kind of give an idea of the size of the response to the COVID impact, sort of almost 3 times the size of what the Great Recession impact. So COVID did have a rather large and continuous impact on our economy. Next slide. And as I said, war in Ukraine continues to affect our world economy. Obviously, you know, it's not as big of an impact as it was February of 2022, but nonetheless, it is impacting our economy. It has impacted world economic growth as well, but the U.S. has remained somewhat resilient. Next slide. So one of the things I would argue here is, you know, rents have been, you know, the question of affordability really has been plaguing Maryland as well as the nation, but Maryland especially, as we struggle to attract and retain workforce. Many people are leaving in some cases to cheaper jurisdictions because they can't afford to live in Maryland. And even in Howard County, median home prices are well above the state's median home prices. Next slide, please. So you can sort of see the Fed has continued to raise interest rates. You know, it is paused. This most recent data, it is expected they're going to pause this week when they meet. There is some speculation that perhaps in May, interest rates will be coming down. We'll see. Next slide, please. Obviously, the Fed has seen some success with raising interest rates. Inflation has come down to somewhere around 3 and 4%, obviously down from its high of 9%. Next slide, please. Just to illustrate, basically, this is sort of our global supply chain pressure index. You can sort of see at the peak, it was rather high, but it's actually gone down significantly, so it's a good sign. Next slide. Gas prices have dropped about 80 cents since summer, so that's been generally a good sign for many consumers who are driving big SUVs. And the hold on their debit card was $125. Many times they did reach that limit. Next slide. So as I said before, one of the things that many consumers are concerned with is you know, the most kitchen table things, right? So gasoline, rent, and food are typically a big thing. Now, every day you go to work, you may pass a gas station, so you're reminded basically of how much gas is. Every week you might go grocery shopping and be reminded of how expensive, you know, groceries have become. And every month you write a mortgage check or you write a rental check, or you pay credit cards, and you see impact of interest rates as well as rising costs. But generally speaking, consumer sentiments have rebounded since December. So at its lowest point, which is around July of 22, which is probably the time at which gas prices were at the highest, and gas prices were at the highest, and inflation was also at its highest. That was significant for many consumers. But you know, you can generally see that consumers were much happier during the pandemic. Perhaps they got to work from home, but generally speaking, many households view the fact that gas prices falling, inflation falling, they're much better off. Next slide. So, home prices have come down in most recent data, but you know, when home prices rose about 20 to 25% during the pandemic, dropping by, you know, a half a percentage point doesn't do much for our home prices. One of the biggest challenges we face, so we've got this twin challenge. Number one is we've got home prices have been rising again, and then also the fact that interest rates have been rising, which means that mortgage rates have been rising. So for many people, holding on to their home rather than selling it has become sort of a necessity, because they couldn't afford to get a new mortgage, because instead of having a 2% mortgage, they might have a 6% mortgage. Next slide. So one of the challenges we face as a nation, we're about you know, 6 million houses short of where we need to be. And again, that was from the 2008 recession, resulted in a huge decline in construction, which we've not really caught up with. And at that time, we saw many Individuals who graduated college remain with their parents or others until such time they could feel they could then afford to buy a house. What we're seeing is the fact that there's a shortage of homes means that basically home prices are continue to go up, and rental rates also continue to go up. So if we were just looking at the home prices matched to the ratio of home prices to median household income in the 1980s, home prices would be nationally about $150,000 less than they are currently. So the housing shortage is going to be a continual challenge. The other challenge is for many households, they've seen great appreciation in their homes. As a result, if they were to sell, by the time, and even if, and again, adjusting for the fact that they can have some gain in their home prices, in some jurisdictions, that gain may be in excess what the amount is to be deferred taxation on. As a result, many homeowners are staying put until such time as they really have to sell. Next slide. Office vacancy rates, we saw about 20%, most recent data. This is obviously a concern for many major cities. Obviously, we're seeing basically many office buildings are selling far less what they were assessed at or what they sold before. This does have an impact on many parking structures in the area, as many of them require a certain number of revenue to pay off the bond, but also first floor retail is also challenged. So again, how we think about retail and residential are going to play a big role in this. Next slide. Now, obviously, there are some opportunities to perhaps change office space into residential units. Again, the challenge for many of the larger cities is having a building that has a 15,000 square foot footprint. Is typically the area. And looking at this data from a Canadian company, they figured that basically there's a good number of offices that could be converted into residential unit, but again, in an era where interest rates are above 5%, and it might be challenging. Whereas before, when interest rates were 2%, it is probably a lot easier. Next slide. So obviously, AI is going to be a continued challenge. And one of the biggest challenges we're seeing right now for many companies is a lack of available workforce. In fact, what we're seeing is many companies are hanging on to their workforce as long as possible because they want to make sure they're able to meet demand if it were to pick up again. Next slide. So again, we're still seeing more openings than people actively looking for work. And again, when people are considered to be unemployed, they are considered to be out of work and actively looking for work. Your son or daughter living in the basement playing Call of Duty, not, graduated college, is not considered to be unemployed. They're out of the labor force. So again, the unemployment rate is fairly low in Maryland, 1.9%. And that's sort of hiding a lot of other things. But there's still more job openings. Next slide. And even in Maryland, the number of job openings exceeds the number of people actively looking for work. And again, some of that might be skills that may not be matching up with the jobs. But generally speaking, that has been something that's been challenging in this state, in this region. Next slide. So again, I think I've shared this slide before. Pre-pandemic, Marylanders were running about 69% labor force participation rate, and that is the labor force divided by the population age 16 and over. It won't be 100% because many people are in school, in the military, or are homemakers by choice, and as a result, they're not in the labor force, but they are in the population. So looking at this, you can sort of see that Maryland dropped, but never actually recovered to its pre-pandemic levels compared to the U.S., which dropped, but then recovered to some extent. We're missing about 120 to 150,000 workers. Everything from early retirement to lack of childcare availability might be driving some of these data. Next slide. So we did kind of look and sort of see what was happening in the world of work by gender and comparing over time. Since 1980, the solid blue lines and the solid pink line are participation rates of the dotted lines, the dotted blue lines and the dotted pink lines are labor force participation rate in the 1980s for men and women respectively. And you can sort of see when you go to the 2022, which is the solid line, you can see that all across the board, except for us old folks, which I include myself in, our labor force participation rates have dropped for men, while women have actually increased the labor force participation rate significantly. Now, there again, a number of explanations. There are more jobs available for women. There are more opportunities for childcare that are available for women. But generally speaking, women have actually increased the labor force participation rate, while men have actually decreased the labor force participation rate across the board. Next slide, please. All right, looking forward into the future. Next slide. Now I need to include some. Next slide. Just to include a little bit about AI, obviously this AI theme, but obviously AI could actually add a significant amount to the global economy, and worker time could be saved. Though, if you all recall, the siren call of the internet was it would increase worker productivity. I posited it might have, but then people now are shopping online, perhaps during the work hours. Next slide, please. 83 million jobs lost and 69 million jobs gained. So a net loss of 14 million jobs because of AI worldwide in the next 5 years. Obviously, this is a concern. And generally speaking, much of the jobs that are going to be lost are jobs that can be easily automated. Everything from research to the good news is car warranty salespeople will no longer be needed. Next slide. The fuel that keeps our entrepreneurship area going is venture capital, and that number has actually decreased. Again, in an era of more expensive money at 5% interest rates compared to 2% interest rates, it is a challenge. Obviously, in the era of the friends, family, and fools model, when we raise interest rates, individuals may not refinance their home to start a business or even invest in their friend's business or even in their kid's business. But this is a big concern. Next slide. So billion-dollar disaster events. Again, climate change is here. We saw that in Ellicott City a couple of years ago. The challenge is now the mitigation of these things, which are going to require resources that could otherwise be used for other things. So the challenge is that yes, it's great that we're able to spend the money to help solve Ellicott City, but that money could have been spent elsewhere. And I would argue better bike paths, but others might disagree. But generally speaking, we're seeing more and more of these events, and they're becoming more and more frequent. So in parts of California, it's difficult to get homeowners insurance. In Florida, similarly, it's hard to get homeowners insurance, or if you are able to get it, it's rather expensive. So again, all these things have a cost, not only to the state and local government, but also to the households in some of these areas as well. And even here in Maryland, next slide, please. I think I've shared this slide. You can sort of see the flooding has become much more frequent. I've got here Annapolis has seen, just the number of flooding that has taken place on the area has increased significantly these last 12 years as compared to the prior 20 or the prior 60 years as well. Next slide. So with all good news, obviously there are some headwinds for the national economy. We can continue the war in Ukraine, terrorist attack, slowing of the world economy, rising interest rates, inflation, volatility in the energy markets. I did put banking systems here. Not only did we see last year some banks sort of have some challenges, but also many banks have on their books their commercial mortgage notes. A divided Congress, supply chain, climate change, again, more frequent, more severe. We saw that most recently here in Maryland, but we're seeing it nationally as well. Tailwind, strong labor markets, softening home prices. Let me dive into Maryland real quick. Next slide. Again, Maryland is growing, but again, as our governor likes to say, we are asset rich but strategy poor. And Maryland's, GDP is growing middlingly. It's not as strong as some of its neighbors. Next slide. Looking at this slide, if I showed you this, I think I showed you this last year. If I showed you pre-pandemic, it looks pretty much the same. We're getting older, and we're relying more on the internet or computers to do what we need to do. So obviously, areas of healthcare is still a significant number of job openings, as well as data scientists are needed in the nation. Next slide. And again, I like to say Maryland's eds, beds, meds, and feds, and the Port of Baltimore. But generally speaking, we're predominantly government. Again, federal government is about 10% of our workforce. Another 5 to 7% is indirect. So the Northrop Grumman's, the SAIC's, all sort of, supporting the government mission here in the state of Maryland. But generally speaking, we are a state that is not big on manufacturing. So out of about 3 million jobs, about 100,000, 110,000 are in manufacturing. Next slide. Maryland's economy, again, the Port of Baltimore, depends on volume. So if that slows down, that impacts the port. Uncertainty around the federal budget. Obviously, they were able to kick the can down the road till March. We do have somewhat of a structural deficit, though that is declining. One thing is population decline. So Maryland lost 20,000 people last census. Affordability continues to be a big challenge here. We are relatively more expensive than some of our neighboring states, so we're seeing people leave. And with the rise of sort of a remote work, it means that many people can find cheaper places to live and still be able to work. Banking, as I mentioned, I'm still concerned about some banks having on their asset sheets some of the commercial-backed mortgages, and labor shortages continue to plague hospitality, eating establishments, in addition to IT, health, and transportation. And you can sort of saw that with the beginning of the school year. It was challenging to get bus drivers in there for Howard County. That has mitigated, but to solve that, Howard County had to actually increase the distance to the schools for people to be able to be walking versus being picked up. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? I don't know whether Steve is here. Steve pointed. I mean, just now Dr. Ronnie talked about the banking, and you are one of the bankers in the committee. Do you have any thoughts on the banking industry's perspective? Okay, I cannot hear you. Not sure whether you already left there. Okay. Any questions from the committee?
Hey, Holly?
Yeah.
Yeah, quick question. You mentioned, I guess, a couple slides about the impact of AI, and one of the slides talked about the net loss in jobs. So my assumption is the jobs that we gain are going to be more high-paying jobs that contribute more to the economy versus the jobs we lose. Is that assumption correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Much of these jobs are easily automated. Actually, I had in one of my other presentations, I actually had a listing of the jobs. So jobs that are likely, to be lost are data entry clerks, accounting, bookkeeping, payroll clerks, security guards, building caretakers, cashier and ticket clerks, postal service clerks, bank tellers, telemarketers. Yay! There may be some shop salespersons lost, door-to-door sales workers, news and street vendors, and the jobs that are to be gained are going to be your heavy truck and bus drivers, vocational education teachers, mechanics, machinery repairers, university and higher education teachers, yay, electronic technology engineers, special education teachers, light truck or delivery service drivers, digital transformation specialists, sustainability specialists. So there's quite a wide range of jobs that are going to be gained and some are going to be lost. But generally speaking, again, it's those jobs can be easily automated with AI. And we're seeing that already, right? You go to some restaurants now, you order on a tablet rather than order to a person.
Yeah. No, I had like a little robot here in Ellicott City deliver my food at one restaurant. But so the net, I guess, fiscal impact on the economy, even though more jobs are lost, is it positive from AI, at least the early estimate?
Well, I mean, these are worldwide estimates. So I imagine there's going to be some loss of the lower wage jobs, and some gain in some of the higher paid. So the net loss, the net could be that we could actually see a bit of a gain in fiscal, in tax revenue. But I would argue that there's still a lot to be discovered, both in terms of research and practical applications.
Thank you.
Can I just balance that a little bit? That the loss mean, I mean, the gain in tax revenue means we have more people to whom we have to provide help. People lose jobs.
Yeah, on the cost side, you mean?
And on the cost side. So the net impact on revenue might not be as bad, but the net impact on what we actually can use is going to be worse.
Right, but I would argue that these job losses are going to occur over several years, if not longer, versus immediately. So I don't see.
But also, Darius, we've got to grow, at least locally. We've got a growing senior population whose income is tabled, and we're not seeing a big move in of people at the end that are on an upward trajectory. So across the region we might, but I'm not sure what we're going to see here. Just a thought.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think Howard County is a challenging place to be as a young professional to buy into, which means that basically, as you said, we have I don't want to say newlywed and nearly dead, as I would describe Santa Barbara, but yeah, we do have a situation where it's difficult to find affordable housing in Howard County.
Yeah, that's an ongoing challenge. I think one of the early presenters also mentioned that, and also that related to the workforce training and the retraining because of the changing, I guess, working situation because of the AI. There's a lot of, I think it's still early in the stage, right? People are still watching.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. It's greatly interesting and very, very informative. A big picture is really good to know. Next with us is Dr. Clint. Dr. Clint, do you want to run from your side or from here? Either way will be fine.
Yeah, let me try to share. Oh, you got them up? But why don't you just run them then?
You just tell me, you just flip. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Because Dr. Irani did such a fantastic job this year, I'm really just going to focus my comments on the Howard County. So we talked about the federal government, we talked about the national government, we talked about Maryland. So nationally, we're in full recovery. Things are looking good. Soft landing, people feel has been achieved. However, as Dr. Irani talked about, Maryland is really kind of lagging in this recovery, one of only 6 or 8 states that have not regained pre-recession employment levels. We're not growing population-wise, we're not growing job-wise. So, those are all things he's covered. So nationally, we're doing great. And this is unlike the last couple of recessions where Maryland has been less significantly impacted. You really have to go back to the 90s. So kind of looking at what does this all mean for Howard County? I'm going to go into the revenue outlook and then my personal income forecast. So if you could hit the next slide. So what drives the county's fiscal conditions? When you look at property taxes and income taxes, they together account for about 69% of all funds and over 80% of general fund revenues for the state. So that's what really, since we're all here to talk about revenues and expenses, these are the drivers, property taxes and income taxes. So what drives them here in Howard County? there are three things that I focused on in the report last year and in the presentation last year, and I'm focusing on them again. So you have population, workforce, and income growth, which really drives property and income taxes. So economic growth in terms of county jobs and businesses that drive property and income taxes again, and real estate, which drives property taxes. So these are the three things I'm going to look at. So going into the issue of population and workforce, I really kind of look at two main areas: population growth and then workforce growth. Because what's important is when people come here that they get jobs, spend money, and pay taxes. When it's highlighted in red, it's a negative for revenue. When it's highlighted in green, it's a positive for revenue for the county. So I think on the population side, we're seeing a real slowdown, and we're seeing out-migration for the first time in years, and an aging population, and those have revenue implications. In terms of workforce growth, we have not, the county's resident workforce and employed base of residents has not yet recovered, so that's a negative, but labor force participation is picking up. So if you could hit the next slide. So let's go in the population growth here. And these are the tables that were in last year's report and will be in this year's report, and these are all in the box, so we can see them. But when you look at, you kind of look at population growth, you can look at, over time, there's been a real change. So really starting with the 70s, Howard County was one of the fastest growing jurisdictions in Maryland. Now I'm just putting the last decade on the left-hand side here. In 2010 to 2020, Howard County gained 44,000 residents. That's the fifth most in the state. The county's population grew by 15%, the second highest in the state. So let's go now to the last 2-3 years. Population growth has significantly slowed. And again, this isn't just in the county, this is in the entire state of Maryland. Since 2020, the county's gained about 2,600 residents, fifth most. But the growth rate has dropped to the 12th highest in the state. So it's dropped significantly. And as we've talked about in the committee here, real estate conditions and policy decisions are driving this. The real estate conditions that we've talked about are, we're running out of land, and policy decisions with growth limitations. We're not developing some of the land we have as fast as we possibly could have. So again, population growth is slowing. And if you could hit the next slide. Now, this is the most troubling slide for me today. Migration has turned negative. So when I talk about migration, I talk about people and households moving into or out of the county. So from 2010 to 2019, the county was one of the fastest growing in terms of net in-migration, gaining about 11,000 residents from international migration and about 10,000 residents from domestic migration. This was the second highest domestic migration in the state, with lots of those domestic migrants moving into Howard County to take advantage of the high quality of life, great schools, location, et cetera, from other counties in Maryland. Now, over the last 2 years, we've seen an out-migration. As domestic out-migration, we now have more people moving out of Howard County to other places in Maryland and more realistically to other places in the nation, as Dr. Irani talked about, kind of heading south. When you look at IRS migrations, and I'm looking at tax filers here, so this is a proxy for households. That's the bottom slide here. We're gaining people from in-state migration, but that number is falling, gaining households, and we're losing residents to out-of-state migration. So when you're looking at in-migration, we're getting residents from Baltimore City and County, Montgomery, and Prince George's County, so kind of higher cost places, Montgomery, and places that don't maybe offer the same vector of benefits as Howard County. But we are losing, and this is a rising number with each year, we're losing residents to Anne Arundel County, Carroll, and Frederick counties, which are lower cost places to, lower cost of housing, lower cost of living. So again, this growth of cost in Howard County is having an impact here. And as a state, we're losing residents to Delaware and southern states, but this is more than likely more retirements than people moving. We are losing people to Virginia. So if you could hit the next slide. So why are people important? You know, apart from the fact that they vote for the politicians that have all put us on this committee here, they're important because they, you know, earn income. That income is what we tax, which talks about the revenues that we're, you know, here to measure, and also the demand. They demand the services. So Howard County remains the highest income, lowest poverty jurisdiction in Maryland. The median household income is over $133,000 a year. This is higher than the nation of Maryland. But again, another troubling sign here is that this is the 15th highest in the nation, down from 6th highest last year. 5.7% of residents in poverty, you know, lowest in Maryland, one of the lowest in the nation. So again, slowing population growth, but high income. If you could hit the next slide. As we've talked about, the county is aging. On the top right-hand side, that's the population growth, kind of 2001, 2011, 2022. And the top yellow part is the population that is 65 and older. It's the share of the population. It's more than doubled, you know, since 2001. And the working age population has, which is the gray bar kind of in the middle, has shrunk, and the orange right under that is kind of the young professional population, which, you know, Howard County, you know, A, they can't afford to be here, and B, we don't really kind of offer the lifestyle that the population of 20 to 35-year-old population wants. So so again, and then when you look at the bottom, it's the annual change in population, and again, the yellow bar is, you know, the growth in the aging population, the population 65 and older. The blue in the middle is the prime working age population, which is really not growing much. And again, since we're coming off of last week's meeting where we talked about schools, the actual number of county residents under the age of 19 has been falling. So it's not just students leaving the schools to be homeschooled or go to private schooling related to COVID. It seems that there's a decline in that population as well. Not quite sure what's driving it, but aging population. So that's kind of a summary of population. If you could hit the next slide. Workforce growth. The county's workforce in terms of people working, labor force participation, so the county's labor force, and the county's employed base of residents, you know, for the last, you know, for the decade prior to COVID, you know, the Howard County is the orange line, the state is the blue, way outpaced the state. You know, however, in the COVID recession, we had a lower or a higher decrease in workforce participation. We had a higher decrease in employed residents in the state of Maryland. That's recovering. We're doing better than the state. But again, that's a troubling sign, and it has not yet recovered in Howard County. So both the number of employed residents is lower than pre-recession levels, and the number of people in the workforce has not recovered either. So again, that's a troubling sign for income growth in the county. If you hit the next slide, the good news is when you look at labor force participation using ACS data, the number of people reporting that they're in the workforce, again, working or looking for work, you know, ticked back up in 2022. So that, again, is a good sign that labor force participation should hopefully go back up to the kind of pre-COVID levels. You know, back in the good old days when, you know almost 3/4 of workforce age population was engaged in work activities. So, you know, that's kind of a summary of population. If you could hit the next slide. The next part of these three things that really drive the county's economy is economic growth. So this is the number of businesses and jobs here in the county. And as we heard 2 weeks ago, the county's economy continues to struggle. And again, this is important because, you know, these residents have jobs and live in Maryland. The employers pay taxes. They drive, you know, they pay rents. You know, the commercial taxes are, you know, kind of the gift that keeps giving to the, county's fiscal base because businesses don't demand high levels of services and they pay property and related taxes. So the fact that economic and employment has not yet recovered is a really troubling sign here for the county. In the 2008 recession, it took 35 months for county employment to regain pre-recession levels. We're now 44 months from the pre-COVID recession peak, and we're not there yet. And I think the biggest issue here in the county is because the county does remain relatively attractive for businesses, is that Maryland is really just not growing and Maryland is losing population. So the fact that the slow growth at the state level is really coming home to roost here in Howard County. So if you could hit the next slide. This really just goes to show the change that has occurred. So on the top chart, we're talking about long-term trends. The orange line with the little squares is Howard County. And you see prior to the COVID recession, the county grew much more rapidly than the state, than the nation, than the two surrounding MSAs that we're part of. It then started to fall in the recession and has not yet recovered. And when you look at the bottom line here, bottom chart here, the county is at the bottom. Everybody else is recovering a little bit better than Howard County, and that is a troubling sign in terms of the county's employment base. The nation recovered by May of 2022, but the state is down 0.5%. The DC Metro is down about 0.5% in terms of jobs. Baltimore Metro is down about 3%. The county is down about 1.6% from pre-recession peaks. And again, that is a troubling sign. If you could hit the next slide. Again, this kind of story of pre and post recession, the county was really hit hard by COVID. In terms of long-term growth pre-COVID, in the decade prior to COVID, the county was 6th in jobs added, 4th in growth rate. Post-COVID, we're the 3rd worst county in post-COVID recovery. We're the 2nd worst in terms of the percentage job decline. And again, this is troubling for the tax base. So if you could go to the next slide. Now, what I do is try to look at what the county's economic composition is. So what we have here is 5-year growth in employment. So 2014, 2019, 2022. I then use a measure called a location quotient, which is the middle column there, that goes, which is really the concentration of employment in an industry. And if it's a LQ of 1, you're at the national average. If you're an LQ over 1, you're more specialized. LQ of less than 1, you're less specialized. And when you get to LQs of 1.2%, you're typically considered specialized, and that would be an export base or a key driver industry. And again, really kind of across the board, in the 5 years, pre-COVID, almost all sectors of the economy grew. In the recovery, all sectors, very few sectors have fully recovered. Professional services, which is a key driver industry, have recovered. But again, the key drivers of the county's economy have not fully recovered. So when you talk about construction, that is a driver. We have an LQ of 1.29, meaning we have about 30% more construction jobs in the county than the national average. Very strong pre-COVID growth, has not yet recovered, remains about 5% down, which again is related to the lack of construction activity. Manufacturing, strong pre-COVID growth, 19% decline since 2019. The county has really been one of the few places in Maryland that are adding manufacturing jobs, and they're starting to dry up. Resident serving industries, retail, accommodation, food services, entertainment, have not yet recovered in the county. These are not part of the county's export base, but again, point to the fact that the situation has not recovered. Now, professional services are the key driver of the county's economy. We have about 3 times the concentration of employment in this, and this ranges from everything from the lawyers to accountants to IT to research. It has recovered, and it has is highly specialized, and this is the growth driver of the Maryland economy, and clearly a growth driver in the county's economy. But again, with the state not growing, with the federal uncertainty that Dr. Irani talked about in terms of where the budget is, not going to be a great driver for the next year or two. A troubling number here is management of companies. So you can think of this as corporate headquarters or back office operations. The county, has experienced very strong growth in this, becoming a place that businesses were moving their headquarters and back office operations to. We're no longer specialized. I'm not really sure what's happening here. Is this the impact of slower federal spending? Is it the impact of COVID on place of work? We're all working from home now, or most of us are working from home at least 2 or 3 days a week. Does that mean that places that are relatively high cost of doing business in terms of rent, like Columbia, Howard County, they're lower than DC, but higher than most of the surrounding jurisdictions, are they just slowing down in getting the employees back to work to keep costs down? Transportation, distribution, logistics, you can think of this as Jessup, but also kind of the Amazon type of stuff. Strong pre-COVID growth, but not yet recovered. So if you could hit the next slide. That's kind of the summary of the economy. I'm now going to dive into real estate conditions. Real estate conditions really do drive property taxes, and they impact income taxes, especially when you think of non-residential development that is where people work and shop. In terms of residential, the good news is that prices remain strong. However, as the Board of Realtors person had talked about, the county is facing inventory challenges. Units are down, low inventory. Permitting is down, multifamily is up over the long term in terms of residential development. Now, non-residential, we had a very strong, growth in this from 2018 to 2022. It fell in 2023, but as we all know, non-residential permitting activity is the value of the permit put in place, and it's very chunky. So you permit something and it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 years to build out. So this isn't necessarily a troubling sign, but I'll go into that in a minute. So if you could hit the next slide. Real estate, this is residential real estate. We have units sold and the active inventory. So units sold is the blue line. Active inventory is the orange line. The units sold, after growing very rapidly, it has dropped precipitously. And again, part of this is the lack of development activity. Part of this is what Dr. Irani talked about in terms of interest rates going up, people staying in their house, not wanting to leave and get a higher mortgage and go somewhere else. And then the gray bars are the median sales price that's on the right-hand axis of the chart. And again, rapid growth here, very strong growth over the last couple of years. So the median sale price grew from 520 last year to 560 in 2023. It's the second highest in Maryland behind Montgomery County, 9th highest in growth. The inventory is very low, 0.7 months, less than a month of inventory. So it's the lowest in Maryland, and the number of units down. So when you talk about the real estate market, which again drives not only property tax growth, but also one-time fees for the county, this type of activity is down precipitously. If you could hit the next slide. This is kind of the slide where I talk about permitting and development activity on the residential side. So on the top right-hand side, is the number of residential permits for units issued in the county. And as you can see, it has been declining and trending downward. Excuse me. Then the chart on the left-hand side on the bottom just takes that numbers and breaks it into multifamily and single-family housing. And what you see is that for the the last 2 years, the level of multifamily development has slowed, but in the 4 or 5 years before that, there was almost half or more of the housing units authorized for construction were multifamily. And from an income standpoint, from a personal income standpoint, from a tax standpoint, that does have implications. Now, not all multifamily is renter, but the census has data on owner occupied versus renter occupied. So, condos, would clearly be a multifamily unit, but counted, we're not getting the issue here. But owner occupied housing have residents in Howard County have much higher incomes. They have $171,000 a year, give or take, in incomes compared to $81,000 a year for people occupying rental units. And the issue is that they're contributing less, or a renter will contribute less to the county's tax base than a homeowner. And then when you talk about, people who live in rental units tend to have smaller households, but it's not by that much. So the income is less than half, but the household size is, pretty comparable. 2.9 people on average in an owner-occupied house versus 2.5. So we're getting a lot less money for these multifamily units, but not necessarily getting slower growth in services. So if you could hit the next slide. Let's talk here about non-residential development. So this is permitting issued to develop non-residential units, so offices, retail space, those types of things. This is essential. As we talked about, over the last couple of years, growing the commercial tax base in the county is a very important goal for the administration. And it's also, commercial development is vital to supporting employment growth, getting back to having businesses and jobs move into and grow into the county. So it's essential to support not only non-residential tax-based growth, but also to support economic growth in the county. So the previous 5 years, we saw substantial non-residential permitting activity. Downtown Maple Lawn, this is what was happening. And so that we saw that. And as you can see on the right-hand side, it's declined precipitously. But again, I think that's less of an issue now because a lot of the stuff that's being permitted over the last couple of years is being built. So this is common in when you track this metric. Now, the county is running out of land, as we've talked about, and the implications that has on residential and non-residential development is that it's going to slow it. We also have the impact of COVID-19, which is, there's less office space being demanded. Many of our, employers are, moving from, designated offices to hot seats. So there's less office space demand per worker. Clearly, we're all buying more from Amazon and online, and that means there's less demand for retail space. And those are all negative and can be expected to impact non-residential patterns of development, nationally and here in Howard County. But on the positive side, the workers who work in downtowns in Baltimore and DC, in parts of Montgomery County, many of them live here in the county. Our costs of rent are much lower. So, you're seeing places like Prince George's County, Howard County benefit from the fact that we have lower office rents than the downtown areas that we surround. But so employers are demanding space closer to their workers and also getting reductions in cost. Now, the other really, we talked a lot about Gateway, I think it was 2 meetings ago, and that is a game changer for the county. So the redevelopment of Gateway has significant impacts in terms of non-residential and residential development here in the county. So if you could hit the next slide. So what does this all mean? Again, using my idea of green meaning good, red meaning worrisome, and what does it mean for the budget? So the key takeaways for my presentation, at least, is nationally there's been a soft landing, has appeared, so the national economy is doing great. This is, there are clearly worrying signs, as Dr. Irani has talked about, but as of today, things look relatively strong. At the state level, Maryland, and this impacts Howard County, is growing slowly. Maryland had a population loss. The employment has not yet recovered, and this makes it hard for a place like Howard County to grow. Howard County conditions, as I've talked about and summarizing them here, We have moderating population growth. I'm a little worried about the out-migration numbers. We'll see if it's just a one-year data point or a trend. The lack of economic recovery is clearly worrisome, and just a general slowdown in development, residential and non-residential, is clearly got implications. So what does this mean for the Howard County budget? I mean, slower population growth and an aging population will translate into lower income growth and therefore lower income tax growth in the county. So we can expect, income growth to be slower than it had been in the past, and income tax growth to be slower than it had in the past. Still positive, it's still better than the state, but just growing more slowly. Interestingly, what does this mean for demand for government services? Does a slower population growth and an aging population mean there's going to be slower and moderating growth in expenditures and capital demands? Clearly, if the county's aging and the number of residents under 19 is declining, we don't need to build as many schools. So the issue is, how will this translate? So on the top side, we have less revenue growth, but we should also experience relatively slower growth in demands for services. Now, less residential development equals less growth in property tax revenues, and also one-time fees, which are very important in the Howard County budget. And less non-residential development has impact on property taxes and an impact on the ability of the county to support growth. The county's got a relatively low office vacancy, industrial vacancy. It's higher than it was pre-COVID, but it's still relatively low compared to competing jurisdictions, and the cost basis in the county is still relatively competitive. So if we don't develop, how are we going to grow the employment base? So that sounds like doom and gloom, and I clearly do have more red on this chart than on this slide than green. However, there are reasons to be cheerful. I mean, if we all remember David Byrne and the Talking Heads from our youth, he has a website called Reasons to be Cheerful, based on Ian Dury and the Animals song. For those of you who like 80s, 70s, 80s music, Howard County remains an attractive place for businesses and residents. We're growing more slowly. More than likely, we're growing more slowly because of A, the slow growth in Maryland, but also B, some of the policy decisions we've made related to growth. But the county remains an attractive and competitive place for business and residents. Now, the other issue is there are clearly opportunities for redevelopment that are, A, occurring, and B, in the pipeline in the county. The downtown Columbia is doing quite well. Gateway is, starting to come in terms of online, in terms of planning. And we've been talking about the Route 1 corridor redevelopment in the county for years, decades probably. That again has real potential. So there are reasons to be cheerful despite some of the negative trends I've talked about here today. And there's reasons to believe that things will get better. So again, reasons to be cheerful moving on. So if you could hit the last slide. These are my personal income projections, which kind of go into the revenue forecast that Holly prepares for us all. We're predicting growth of 5.1% in 2023, which looks quite good. So it's good by historic standards. But let's really do point out that for 2022, the county's personal incomes grew really slowly by 3%. And again, that means that revenues are going to grow relatively slowly, because it takes 2 to 3 years for revenue to be realized at the county level for once it's earned. So while these numbers look relatively good going forward, we are must have to come to grips with the fact that incomes grew, pretty slowly in 2022. Now expected to recover, but we still have to deal with the near-term projections. Now there's going to be recovery of employment and workforce in 2024, I'm predicting, and continue to exceed state growth going through. So the lack of development will slow this down, but again, we should continue to see personal income growth in the 4+ range, and again, exceed the state's level. So I think I went a little too fast, but we only have 4 minutes left. So we've gone relatively long. I can take any questions here unless I put you all to sleep.
Thank you, Dr. Clench. There, it's always very helpful and really critical to our revenue forecast on that. And I appreciated that we lay out both the some solid base and some long-term concerns ongoing. And if we look at the long-term sustainability issues there, so we probably can still do 1 or 2 questions. Anybody want to jump in?
Hey, Richard.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's Josh. How much of this story, and Darius' story as well, is really what chunk of this story is because of an aging population? Like, we lost people in the workforce because we had an older population where people of certain means just decided not to go back to the workforce when COVID ended. We're having a problem with basically regenerating housing and bringing in new residents because older residents have refinanced and they're just don't want to really go anywhere. And we have, people not, or we have somewhat of an out migration because the residents that do want to go someplace are retiring. Like, what's the percentage of our problems is related to just the aging demographic, and then what part of it is our own policy choices relatively that we decided to stop growing?
Howard County's median age is still lower than the state average, still lower than the national average, because so we're aging, but we're not in the same place as other areas. So clearly an aging population is one of the factors, and clearly contributed, in my opinion, to the decline in labor force participation and employment. I think another real factor is that Howard County has a very high level of income, high level of dual income families, where during COVID and lots of children compared to, again, because we have a lot of people in the middle age groups and working age groups, where one person could afford to stay home and that person necessarily hasn't. So it's not just aging, and the county's median age is lower than the national and state average. Therefore, there's other things going on here. And clearly, I think the issue of real estate development and this, is it the policy decision or is it the fact we don't have any land? And I don't know. I'd love to see that number, and I don't even know how to make it up. But clearly, the decision to limit growth impacted this decision, or this population change. However, in the absence of APFO, in the absence of increasing impact fees, we still would have run out of land. So
we've always had the same amount of land from 1700 to now. It's just, how do we want to develop that land?
All right, so I'm talking about decisions that are made recently, like ABFO and impact fees, versus decisions that were made decades ago, ag preservation. I think clearly, if you could, and it could never happen legally or open up wide swaths of land for develop, the fact that we have high quality schools, great location, and the fact that we're limiting growth on the 70 corridor, which is again the kind of an area of untapped growth potential in Maryland. Recent policy decisions, APFO, real estate fees, impactful, we still would have run out of land. Ag Pres can't touch that one. But that decision was made long ago.
Thank you very much. Good question.
Any other questions? So I've bored everybody.
No, I think you covered a lot. Thank you very much, Dr. Clinch. And I know we still have a chance to come back if needed there. For the sake of time, I would say wrap up today's meeting. There's a lot of interesting and useful information to digest continuously. And next week we will be meeting on Wednesday, I think the 7th, same time, 3 p.m. And at that point, partially informed by today's discussion and also previous presentations, and also based on updated information, Budget and Finance will provide preliminary projections on the county's revenue, about multi-year projection, and the county's debt service and debt indicators, as well as some credit rating related information. So I think that will be important for the committee as well. And after that meeting, it will be more discussion about, for the committee to discuss about what are the important either things to highlight or recommended in the report. And at that point, the vice chair, Steve Pointed, is going to chair the committee discussion. With that, I'll wrap up today's meeting, and thanks again everybody for participation, and thanks to all the speakers today for bringing us very hopeful discussion and information. So the meeting is adjourned. See you next time. Thanks.